Good evening, everyone. How's everyone doing? All right? Great. It's great to see many old friends and some new folks here. My name is Steve Rothstein. I'm the Executive Director of the John F. Kennedy Library Foundation, and thrilled that you're all here. And we have a really special panel. I'll just get to them in 1 minute. First, on behalf of all of the library team and the foundation team, thank you for being here. We're thrilled that you're here tonight. And it is humbling to work with the library and the foundation team. They do an amazing job each and every day. And there's lots of other activities. Some of you may know we also have an Ernest Hemingway exhibit that's open through the end of December. Encourage you to come back if you want to look at that sometime. We also, next Wednesday, John Dickerson from CBS is going to be here speaking about the election and his new book and some other things. I also want to thank our sponsors for tonight, Bank of America, the Lowell Institute, and our media sponsors, the Boston Globe, Xfinity, and BUR. We really appreciate their partnership tonight and for other forums. So I'm going to introduce our moderator and then speakers very briefly. First, I think we all know Margery Eagan and hear her all the time and learn so much from her on the radio and WGBH, and she's been partnering with Jim Braude and writing for the Herald and so many other things that we have so much wisdom from her. But you may not know that she also, in 2015, won first place of excellence for religious commentary in the Religious News Writers Association, and has done so much more in this. So she's particularly appropriate for tonight. Father Bryan Hehir is at Harvard University and does such a great job with the students there. He also has written some very thoughtful and insightful works on his own, and is the Secretary for Healthcare and Social Services in the Archdiocese of Boston. We also are thrilled, obviously, to have Mark Shriver here. Mark, in his, quote, full-time day job, is the president of the Save the Children Action Network, and they do great advocacy around the country on such important issues that are more important now than ever before. He's a former legislator in the state of Maryland and has so many other accomplishments. While we're here to talk about pilgrimage, I first just want to say, if you haven't read his other book, A Good Man, I encourage you to do it. I just did and was really moved. I thought I knew a little bit about his father, but I learned so many insights. So thank you for sharing this with us. But, and then after that book, wrote the book that we're going to talk about tonight, Pilgrimage, and this is really moving. He spent a few years, traveled the world, followed in the footsteps of the Pope, and really has a lot of insights. And, you know, one sentence in the book where Mark says, "I'd been yearning for a church I could believe in again." And it really kind of sums up in many ways. I actually am such a big fan of the Pope, my wife accuses me of asking me if I'm going to convert sometime. Maybe, we'll see, not quite yet. So after the forum, again, there'll be a presentation, there'll be a Q&A, and then Mark's going to be signing copies of the books. Thank you. Without further ado, our host, Margery. Margery?
Thank you. Thank you very much. I'm always, whenever I do something having to do with Catholicism, I always wish my parents and my maiden aunts were here, because my Sacred Heart educated mother and my maiden aunts, whose house was filled with relics and rosary beads, mostly they'd hear about their disgraceful reporter daughter writing all these disgraceful stories criticizing the Catholic Church. But there's redemption, Father, because here I am tonight talking about the Pope and Mark's terrific book, Pilgrimage. So what I thought we'd do is start a little bit talking about your book, Mark, for people that haven't had a chance to read it yet, and congratulations, you did a wonderful job. Talking about where you both were when Pope Francis became the Pope 3 years ago, where you see the church then, where you see the church now, and where you see the church going, and end a little bit with what the American Catholic Church's response might be to the President-elect Trump in terms of refugees and issues of social justice that the church cares so much about. So we just heard mention of your talking about how you were looking for a church that you could be proud of. But you talked a lot in the book about the Catholicism of your family. You talked about, tell us a little bit about that, about your grandmothers, speaking of rosary beads, saying the rosaries, growing up in a church with a mom and dad that went to daily mass, growing up as a Catholic.
Sure. Thank you very much, Margery. I thought when you said that first thing, that was the first question. I was like, oh my God, I hope there's a little vodka in my water here, because thank you for giving me another one. I want to say what an honor it is to be here with you and Father Hehir, who was always around when I was growing up. He's great friends with my mom and dad, and all I remember is my father going, that guy is brilliant. So I'm very nervous up here today with Father Hehir, Harvard, brilliant. Cardinal O'Malley likes him, so he's a big shot. But thank you both, and thank you to the library and to the library staff for putting this together. And thank all of you so much for coming. The book is really an effort to try to figure out who Pope Francis is. And when I wrote that line about being in a funk a little bit about Catholicism, I think it had nothing really to do with the men and women, the nuns and the priests that I know, not only in Maryland, but around the country. Father Hehir, the Jesuits at Holy Cross, where I went to college. I went to a Jesuit high school in Maryland. I've worked with nuns that are teaching in the Deep South. I mean, the respect I have for that level of the Catholic Church is immense. The Catholic Charities in Washington, D.C. is the largest provider of social services. They're doing great work. My college roommate at Holy Cross is actually a Catholic priest. He's my pastor. So I have huge admiration for the work that's going on at that level. At the level of the Curia and what was going on in Rome kind of threw me for a loop. The sexual abuse scandals that you all know so well here in Massachusetts, the issues around the Vatican financial situation, some of the comments about Islam, some of the comments about women, that was so disconnected from the reality of my interactions with Father Hehir and Father Kuzniewski and Sister Pat, that I was in a little bit of a funk on that. And when Pope Francis was elected, having spent 7 years in Jesuit education as the first Jesuit Pope, when he got up on that altar and asked for the people in front of him to bless him, it kind of took me back. The next day when he paid his hotel room, when he got down on his knees a couple of weeks later at that juvenile facility, and I worked with juvenile delinquents, Margery, for 7 years in Baltimore, and I had been in those types of places. They're juvenile jails, really. And I wouldn't get on my knees today to wash those kids' feet. And this is a 76-year-old man washing the feet of a Muslim girl and then going to Lampedusa to be with the refugees. I mean, it was like, wow, who is this guy? And I wanted to dig in to figure out whether these were publicity stunts for good PR for the Catholic Church, or whether this was really someone that could rekindle my joy in the church and teach me how to be more joy-filled. Because if a 76-year-old guy was this excited about his work and was getting on his knees and washing the feet of those kids, there was something to be learned there. So that's why I jumped in and had this wonderful opportunity to spend 2.5 years not talking to the big shots, the state representatives down there in Argentina or the power brokers. I didn't talk to the cardinal. I talked to, the guy who picks up trash, who picks up cardboard and plastic, who's very close with the Pope, who is in this world popular movements, which we can talk about. The mother who lost a child in a nightclub fire, who became very good friends with the Pope after they had a very combative relationship. And the list goes on, the priests who work in the villas, which are, in other words, for the slums. And these are the folks that I think have the real insight to who Jorge Mario Bergoglio was and is. And there are some people that, clearly don't like the Pope in Argentina, and I talked to them as well to get a full picture of the man.
So tell us, when the Pope became the Pope 3 years ago, where was the church, in your view, the day before he became the Pope, and where did it become afterwards? You've been involved in a controversy or two yourself, Father Hehir.
So the hard questions are coming later, right? That's the idea.
Maybe we should just have the conversation between us.
Be safer, I'll tell you. So, the church lives at multiple levels. It lives at the universal level, it lives within nations, and it lives at the local level in parishes and towns. And so the church was in different places, I think. Pope Benedict was an extraordinary mind, an extraordinary, capable theologian who was crucially instrumental in the Second Vatican Council. He was not an administrator, and his first love was to preach, to teach, and to write, and he did it. And I think his writings will be read long after he's dead. But at the universal level, the Vatican was in big trouble. It just was, the administration had gotten away from him, and there were questions that were then publicized in the press all the time. So a sense at the universal level that things were a bit out of control. At the national level, here, the sexual abuse crisis was the dominant reality. It was just with us and has stayed with us. It is going to take generations to come through that, through the healing. And I think the major tragedy and the major impact of the sexual abuse crisis was first in the people who were abused and their families. But at an institutional level, what happened with the sexual abuse crisis, I'm convinced the major tragedy is the loss of trust.
Yeah.
And that loss of trust is two-dimensional. The trust between the people of the church and their leadership, and then secondly, the trust and reputation of the church in the wider civil society. So trust was just lacking. And I think one of the things this Pope has done, Mark describes it as a church he wants to believe in. I think other people also would say, I want a church I can trust again. And I think this Pope has multiple gifts. Technically, we talk a lot about charisma.
Yes.
In a political campaign, we talk more about it than we see most of the time. But charisma has a religious meaning. It is a grace given to a person, not for their own welfare, but for what they can do for others. This Pope has a charisma that gives a chance to rebuild trust and faith in the church. And that cuts down through every level.
Well, Mark, you talk in Pilgrimage about your attraction to this Pope and how it did kind of get you out of this funk. So talk about it. As I said, it's been 3 years now. What is it about, and then we're going to get back to some of the stories of you following all in his footsteps all through Argentina, et cetera. But tell us about what it is about him in these 3 years that has made a difference for you in your Catholicism.
Well, I think he's incredibly challenging. I like to picture myself as a progressive Catholic. And I'll just tell you one quick story. This concept of mercy, which we just ended, this extraordinary Jubilee of Mercy year. And when he first brought it up, I thought, that he meant that I was supposed to be kinder to people, or maybe to give more money to my favorite nonprofit. But he's talking about mercy on a completely different level. And he told this story, In the Name of God is Mercy, and I put it in the book, of which he was the head of the rector, the head of the formation house there. And a woman came over who had 3 young children. Her husband had left her, and she had a part-time job and didn't have enough money to support her young children. So she had turned at times to prostitution. And he had sent food down through Caritas, the Catholic charity organization, to feed the kids and the woman. And she came around Christmas and asked for him. He came down and said, "Oh, I'm glad you got the food." And she said, "Well, thank you for the food, but I really wanted to thank you because you always called me Signora." And
The respect.
it's respect, and it's like seeing into that person's soul and figuring out that what they really needed was the food, of course, but what they really, really needed was to be treated with respect and to be treated as a human being. And to enter into what his definition of mercy, I think, is around entering into that person's chaos, their confusion, their joys as well. And, after studying and talking to people for 3 years, That's what he's talking about. So when I look at a homeless person now, do I call them Mr. or Mrs.? Do I ask them their name? Do I ask them how their family is or where they're from? And to be honest with you, most of the time I would avoid people that were homeless. I'd put my head down and walk by or say, I don't have any money. And I watched it the other day when I was in here in Boston 2 months ago, and there was a homeless lady on the corner. I'm there in the back bay, and person after person walked by her. And look, I'm not perfect by any stretch, but trying to, have that conversation with homeless people now. I used to think I was too busy to go to work. I had to get to work. I had to do all of my work. I was really an important person. And now I have a 10-minute conversation with a homeless person. And there's a guy, Robert, who lives in works in our block, or lives in our block, really, where I work. And, you get a little relationship going, and I still get to work on time. It's no problem. I'm still doing the same amount of work. But I think it makes me a little bit more sensitive and more aware of what's going on. And these little gestures he makes that are charismatic, but they're grounded in substance, and it's how you treat people differently makes a big difference. If you ask my wife and kids if I'm doing better, they probably say they can't tell the difference. But I think, it's these little gestures that he does when he invites homeless people to the Vatican for his birthday, when he goes and visits prisoners. When he comes to America and he gets in a Fiat, and all the big leadership in America gets in those huge SUVs, and that 78-year-old man gets in the back seat of a little Fiat. I mean, he's sending a message to us. And I think that's a huge challenge. So for me, that has been, as a, quote, progressive Catholic, has been great. And my friends who are conservatives are also challenged by the man.
Well, let's talk about this Year of Mercy for a second, because one of the things that the Pope has done during this Year of Mercy is re-looked at divorced and remarried Catholics getting communion who have not gone through the annulment process. It's a little controversial among some of the conservative clergy. We know that some of them have been complaining this week about this and want him to clarify what his position is. But it does seem to me an acknowledgement that not everyone whose marriage doesn't work. I mean, sometimes there are extenuating circumstances that cause marriages through no one's fault to fall apart. So what does that mean, that Year of Mercy? How has that been an outreach to those divorced and remarried Catholics who do want to still participate in the church?
Well, I think generally, first of all, on the Year of Mercy, Francis has an ability to combine words with deeds. I think that's part of the connection. He says things and then he does things. What he does reinforces what he says, and what he says reinforces what he does. And obviously on this question, he frankly has opened it up in the church for discussion. He made an initial move in this direction by placing it on the agenda in what's called the Synod of the Family, where bishops are gathered from throughout the world. He put it on the agenda at that meeting. There were sort of stages to the Synod on the Family. At first, it looked as though there was going to be a dramatic move on this. As the Synod went along, it pulled back somewhat. He continues to put it into discussion. I think one of the people who's analyzed him best, says that what he is trying to do, not just on this case, but on others regarding mercy and approachability in the church, what he's trying to do is to push the envelope as far as he can without changing church doctrine. I mean, that's basically, and he moves out to the edge of the circle by word and deed. But if someone says, did he violate the church teaching? The answer is no. Now, where a discussion like this goes, in all honesty, I have no idea. But I certainly know that he's generated the discussion. There's been a lot of talk about how priests individually can deal with individual cases. To some degree, that's always been there, but it's been in a very restricted form, and therefore the opening of this discussion and the question about how priests function in these complicated situations, because you're absolutely right. You can't be ordained 5 years before you find out marriage is complicated.
Yeah.
You know?
He's pushed up the envelope. He's pushed right to the edge of the envelope on a lot of things, I would say.
Well, he does. That's what I mean. It's word and deed. And it's different things. You know, think of people who head large organizations. What's the most precious thing they've got? It's their time. And how they spend their time makes the difference. So Mark's got it just right. He's installed as the Pope. His papacy's inaugurated. What's his first visit outside the Vatican? It's to Lampedusa.
For the refugees.
He comes back in. He visits the Jesuit Refugee Center. He then moves. If you look at the trips that he takes, those are strategically chosen trips. He goes to places that are not at the center of world politics. He chooses cardinals from places that have never had cardinals before. And in a sense, it is trying to kind of lift up before the world what you might call the edge of the circle and lift it up for its attention. So these kinds of things are strategically chosen. There's no question in my mind about that.
And that's very much in keeping in line with his Ignatian background, right, Father? I mean, Ignatius talked about Jesuits being, you know, the army, if you will, for God, and being willing to go to the frontiers, to go to the edges. And that is very much consistent with what he was as cardinal and as bishop. And what attracted him to the Jesuits, he was, you know, wanted to go to Japan, couldn't go because he had lost essentially most of his lung and wasn't healthy enough to go. But that going to the edge, reaching out to the poor and the powerless, as you just described it so beautifully, is consistent with Ignatian spirituality.
That's right. We don't want to hurt your feelings. Of course, you're not a Jesuit. You're
Right,
just a
that's
diocesan priest, but that's okay.
That's right. I did have a professor in seminary, at the diocesan seminary, who said whenever he gave a good talk and somebody said, "You must be a Jesuit," he'd say, "No, we read books too."
I didn't say you didn't read books.
So Mark, tell us a couple of, you've got a bunch of great stories about traveling sort of in the footsteps of Pope Francis and his childhood. You talk about how he was supposed to go out and meet with some of his school friends and his girlfriend, who was in high school then, I think he was 16 years old, and instead he did something else. Tell us about that.
He went to confession and reconciliation, and had evidently, obviously, a wonderful experience in there, and walked out of that confessional in a basilica that's wedged between two buildings on a very on a busy street in Flores, which is the neighborhood he grew up in. So he goes into this basilica early in the morning and comes out and decides he wants to be a priest. And he's studying chemistry at that time, and he's working for a woman who is an atheist, a communist, and runs the clinic or the lab that he's working in, and she's from Paraguay. So, you know, the vibe in Argentina is that Argentinians are obviously the first amongst all equals. They're, you know, in many cases considered to be very arrogant, particularly folks from Buenos Aires who are called porteños. And this Jorge Mario Bergoglio is working for a woman who's an atheist and a communist and a foreigner, running her own business in a science lab, and he decides he's going to become a priest, and he still keeps working with her for 2 more years. And that, you know, confessional is still there. It's right in the middle of...
Which you saw.
Yeah, it was in there,
right?
yes. And there's, you know, people are coming in and out with strollers. I mean, nobody, you know, says, "Oh, that's the confessional of Pope Francis." If you ask around, they'll point it out. But it's right in the middle of the city. And I first thought when he had this moment in a basilica, it was going to be a big, beautiful, fancy church. But it wasn't. And it's kind of fitting that he had his moment and decided to become a priest in a very lower middle class neighborhood, in a very busy, lively area that wasn't surrounded by big theologians and fancy columns and lots of art. It was right in the middle of his community.
And talk about his own faith life. I mean, you talked about your own with grandparents and parents that were very staunch Catholics. What about the popes?
He has Father mentioned Francis going to Lampedusa to see the refugees. His mother and father came from Italy, His mother was a devout Catholic, Rosa, and stood up on a chair in the middle of a public square and denounced Mussolini. The family sold their coffee shop, took what money they had, and went to Italy to be with other family members. When Bergoglio's mother and father were introduced by a Salesian priest who was from Italy as well. They were married, and 12 months later, Jorge Mario Bergoglio is the first child born. Grandmother lives around the corner. There's a park right in the middle of that working class neighborhood. Grandmother teaches him how to say the rosary, teaches him the lives of the saints, takes him to festivals. And it's almost an idyllic, beautiful surrounding. But I found a couple of months ago this letter that he wrote to somebody who took him around Brazil, in which he talked about his childhood as being beautiful and being grounded in an earthy Catholicism, but also being surrounded by a lot of pain because his family lost their money. And I'd written the chapter about how serene and beautiful it was. And I got, oh my God, I found this letter, and I got to rip the chapter up and start all over. But when I really thought about it, it showed, I think, an even more fuller picture of the man, because he cried himself to bed as a kid, and he saw that pain. And I think that really helps explain to a degree both the beauty and the adherence to Catholicism, but also being aware of the pain that families undergo and the sadness that they experience, through failed businesses or tough situations.
Why did he decide to become a Jesuit?
He goes to study to become a diocesan. The seminary that was run for the diocese was run by the Jesuits. And he had a near-death experience. He lost, parts of his lung. And on that deathbed, if you will, much like Ignatian of Loyola, who had a near-death experience when he, almost died after battle, he decides to become a Jesuit. And he's attracted to the military, the discipline, the real focus, and the willingness to go out to the frontier that the Jesuits were trained to do. This concept of having a bag ready, or what they said in Argentina is having a leg up, which meant you were literally ready to go if you were commissioned by the Pope or by your Father General, or by the provincial in that area, you're ready to go. And I think he wanted to go, to Japan. And ironically, for a guy who travels so much, Father, he's lived almost his entire life in Buenos Aires, in, essentially downtown Argentina. It's crazy.
So, Father Hehir, you said you've got an inside dope story on the Pope that you'd like to share with us tonight?
Well, it's about the Pope, but it's really about the U.S. Congress. It was about that magnificent address that he gave to the U.S. Congress.
Oh, it was great.
That was just a piece of work. But I was talking to a congressman after that, and he said, I was having a hard time hearing the Pope because of his accent. He said, he talked about three people. So he said, Martin Luther King. He said, I got that. And then he moved on. And then he said, I thought he said, Doris Day. And he said, I said to myself, what's going on here? We got Martin Luther King and Thomas Merton and Doris Day.
Yeah.
Now, you have to have an audience of a certain age for that to mean anything to people, but this one does. Yeah, That's
right. But he was talking about, of course, Dorothy Day.
Dorothy Day,
a Catholic
right,
worker, but she
right.
had kind of a wild and crazy youth herself. She was a big
Well, she was, but she wasn't Doris Day.
No,
that's for sure.
She was not Doris Day. So let's talk about where the church is now in terms of, as you said, Father Hehir, he's not changed the rules, but he's moved to the edge of the envelope and talked about having mercy for the divorced and remarried Catholics, allowing priests, he's talked about this again, to forgive women who've had abortions. He's talked about the famous "Who am I to judge?" The rules haven't changed, but as James Carroll has written about so beautifully, the tone has.
Yeah.
So
some of the rules have changed. So he has changed rules.
Which rules?
Well, now you're going to pin me down. You mentioned the one the other day where he extended the possibility of priests forgiving sin regarding abortion.
Yes.
That had been, Cardinal O'Malley had granted that here in the diocese, so it could have been changed, but he didn't. I
He's been
I
softer
can't.
on birth control.
Huh?
He was softer on birth control and the Zika virus when he was talking
Well,
about.
he did. He gave talk on the Zika virus. That had some precedent earlier in long ago with the nuns in the Congo. That's a whole other story. That was many years ago. I think he's changed the rules in the sense that he inherited a very bad situation, as I said, inside the Vatican, for example, on the Vatican finances.
Yes.
The Vatican finances have been a stone around the neck of the universal church for ages. So he brought in outside folks who were skilled. He has a great trust, I think, in lay people and their skillful ability, the professional skills they have. So he brought in a whole outside team and he gave them full access to the documents. I was on a panel about 2 years ago on the Pope, and this young woman was on the panel with me. I didn't know her. She belonged to a financial group in Virginia, and they were one of the companies that the Pope had engaged to look at Vatican finances. And she was very interesting. She said, I'm really a bank examiner. They bring me in when there's trouble. But she said, when I was asked to do this job, she said, I felt my whole life had been in preparation for it. And she said, I have access to everything I want to see. Everything I want to see is done. So there was that part of the dimension. He created this C9 council that Cardinal O'Malley's on. That's a kind of outside group, outside the structure of the bureaucracy of the Vatican. He's used that as a kind of a kitchen cabinet. So the rules are of different kinds. Some of them bear on religious moral questions. Some of them bear on how the church does its business. But some of the ways we were doing our business wasn't a help. So the long-term effect of this, I think, can be helpful.
But I asked you how old you were very rudely before you came on. We came on the stage. You told me you were 52, so you're the youngster here on the stage, and you've got young children, Mark Shriver. Catholicism remains a hard sell. A lot of people expected, because of this charismatic Pope Francis, that we would get people back into the pews, and that hasn't really happened. Those of us who worried about people's lack of trust in organized religion, I read this piece, the statistic, I think it was the Gallup poll, it said 42% of Americans have lost trust. Only 42% of Americans trust organized religion. Only 8% of Americans trust Congress, so organized religion is doing much better than Congress. But still, among your friends and among your kids' friends, or maybe even among your kids, Catholicism is a hard sell. So something's missing. We're not able to bring people back. What do you think is wrong?
Well, it's an interesting question on a couple of different levels. When I was in Argentina, in Buenos Aires, I talked to a number of the priests that worked in the more remote areas of Argentina, and a number of them who worked in the villas, the poor areas. And I said to them, people come to Mass here every Sunday, right? And they come when they can, and because sometimes there aren't enough priests. And, people have to work 2 or 3 jobs to make a living, and if they can't come on Sunday, it's okay. And my initial reaction was, wow, they're not good Catholics if they're not going on to Sunday Mass, are they? And they're like, no, they're definitely good Catholics. They believe in Jesus. They're listening to the church's teachings. They're good people. They're just not coming to Mass every day. And I think that undoubtedly causes concern on a couple of levels. But I think that the Pope is I talked about that example, which may have been a silly one, of the homeless guy in Washington, D.C.
No, it's a great example.
And, I think the Pope is planting these seeds. He uses that analogy, and he's watering seeds that were planted by the previous generation or the generation before. And I think if he can get people to deal more intimately with each other and have a more intimate relationship with God, that is ultimately the most important thing that the church does. Do they want fannies in the church, making contributions? Of course, that's part of it. But if the church is really doing its job, it's moving us spiritually to want to have a better connection to God, which is what we're all longing for, whether we're Catholics or Protestants or Jews or Muslims. I think we're all trying to figure out that relationship. And when a priest can, or a nun can lead you to that, making that connection, that's a powerful thing. So it may not necessarily be more people on Sunday Mass at 9 o'clock. That would be great. But I think if he's teaching us how to have that connection and develop our spiritual side, that's a really powerful thing.
Well, I'm going to be superficial here for a moment, but it's not that superficial because the Pope actually talked about it in his book, saying that priests need to step up to the plate on these homilies. They're not doing such a great job in the homilies. But you must have been to one or two, we talked about this, Mark, Catholic masses or funerals where the music, you just wanted to die, you just wanted to die. The singing is off key, the guitarist can't play the guitar. We have all these beautiful chants from years ago, and why can't we fix the music?
I haven't got the wrench.
You haven't got the wrench? Okay.
Well, but one of the most astute sociological observers of Catholicism in the 20th century was Andy Greeley. And
yes.
Greeley started a process at the time Vatican II ended, 1965. And every 5 years after, he would do a major study of where Catholics were. And by the end of the century, just before he died, actually, he argued that what made a welcoming parish was three things: good preaching, good music, and a community that welcomed people. Francis is big on community that welcomes people.
Yeah.
And now it's easier to say than to do, to be very honest. And my own sense is, you're right, that, here in the United States, if I'm right about the trust factor, then you think, well, how do you repair trust? And I think it's a multi-dimensional kind of exercise that doesn't happen overnight. I think you repair it partly by institutional changes in the way the church runs. You can secondly repair it at the pastoral level, how people are cared for, and then you probably gets to be one-on-one when it's a matter of trust. That if you've changed things in other ways and people are willing to take a second look at the church, there's still a deeply personal journey of re-engaging people. My own sense is the Catholic Church here in the Archdiocese and in the country, it's like three circles. There are the people who are sitting in front of you on Sunday, and you've got to take good care of them. They lived through this difficult time, and they've lived faithfully throughout their life. There's a second circle of people who used to be in the benches and are not, but they're still there. They probably define themselves as Catholic, but they have their own ways of connecting, and it may not be direct participation. The possibility of reaching them is crucial, because if you don't reach that second circle, you're going to lose this generation and the next generation. And then we'll be like the church in Europe in the 19th century when they locked the working class. The third circle of people who may have never had any contact with the church at all and find an interest there. And Francis has done a good deal of that. I am not used to being stopped in the hallways of Kennedy School and have faculty say to me, "Did you hear what the Pope said yesterday?" That has not been my experience most of the time, but it happens now.
Well, there was this great headline a little while back in the New York Times. It said, Pope Francis in race against time to reshape the church. And it was talking about his appointing cardinals that seemed to be, and correct me if I'm wrong, Father, but less about the rules and less about the rigidity and more about the mercy and the welcome that we've been talking about. That's kind of an exciting prospect for the church going forward.
I agree. I think it's really exciting, and you see it. Father Hehir mentioned the pastor-like cardinals that have been appointed both here in the United States and around the world. And again, I think that sets an example, and he's starting to fill the ranks of cardinals that will vote in the next conclave. which we hope obviously won't happen anytime soon, but they're more in that background of being pastors, of caring about, as he says, their sheep, and having their shoes muddied by being out on the street. I think it's exciting, and you see that in major cities across the U.S. right now.
I've noticed when I see pictures of the Pope, sometimes it looks like he's expanding a little bit, in the waistline, eating more pasta than maybe he should. We want him to diet so he can stay healthy, to keep appointing these cardinals, right?
I think he has trouble with his legs, so he can't exercise a lot.
Okay.
That must be it.
Okay. I want to talk a little bit about...
Can I just tell you, I'll tell you one quick story
What?
about that. So when I was down in Argentina, the pictures of Cardinal Bergoglio, he was very skinny. He was gaunt,
yes.
and he
You've
didn't...
got great pictures in your book, by the way.
Thank
great
you.
Pictures.
He didn't smile a lot, and I talked to his press secretary, who's a priest, Father Marco, and he said, he would joke a lot, and he was great one-on-one, but when he went out in public, there was so much pressure on the Argentinian economy. They went through a depression in 2001, very similar to our depression in the 30s, where 25% of the population was unemployed, and the dollar, their value, the currency was devalued dramatically, almost overnight. And he was gaunt and skinny and didn't smile a lot. And his priest friend, press secretary, said, he's gotten so fat. And he goes, he's eating so much pasta, and he's smiling. And I said to him, because I asked a number of his friends, he seems to smile much more now than he did. And the one guy said to me, it's the Holy Spirit. He was made for this job, and he's enjoying eating, he's enjoying going out and being with the babies and being with the people. He had that sense of him, he wanted to be out when he was cardinal, but he didn't smile, and he didn't eat, and he didn't enjoy it as much as he's enjoying it now. So he has sciatica, you read that it flares up and causes him pain, and I know how painful that can be. But he's also, filled with the Holy Spirit, and he is, I think, completely spiritually free. And I don't think he really cares about, what people think or say about what he's doing. It's not a 1 or 2 year election cycle here. We kind of in America try to put him in a box.
Yeah.
I think we really do. We try to make him, I'm a progressive, he's a progressive. Because he says certain things, I'm progressive, he's in my box. And then conservatives say something else, and somebody says, well, he's leaning Republican or Democrat, or he's really an independent. He's none of those. He works for one person, one entity, and that's Jesus Christ. And he, I think, is watering the seeds. He's planting the seeds, and he doesn't care about 2 year cycles, and he's enjoying life. So he's a little plump, but that's okay.
No, that's okay.
It's okay.
We're running a little short of time because I want to leave time for questions, but a couple of things I wanted to touch on. I mentioned before, President-elect Trump, and back in February, the Pope criticized Trump a little bit about immigration, and when he was talking about building the wall and saying he wasn't a Christian, he should be building bridges and not building walls. And then Trump called the Pope a pawn of Mexico, and they had a little back and forth. Now that he's been elected, Trump has been elected, the Pope has talked about mutual acceptance and fraternal cooperation. And somebody wrote a piece about there's some similarities between them, in the sense that they're both outsiders, they're both shaking up the establishment, both talking about welcoming the excluded, both like Twitter a lot. You can follow the Pope on Twitter, and Donald Trump is a famous Twitter guy. But I wonder, in the American Catholic Church, because the Pope has been so about immigration, about refugees, if there is, and we don't know because the president-elect is kind of changed on his opinions about things and been back and forth backed away from some of the hard lines he had during the campaign. But if he does adopt a hard line on immigration, what do you think the response of the American Catholic Church will be, particularly in light of the Pope's welcome to refugees?
Yeah. First of all, I think generally the way the Church deals with the political order is we don't talk about people, we talk about principles, and we talk about policies. So The approach is not to the personality, but to the policies that they adopt. Immigration is in the DNA of the American Catholic Church. We came as an immigrant church. From 1850 through 1950, there was a constant stream that built the church in the United States through immigration. The interesting thing about the church today, the Catholic Church in the United States today, we used to be called an immigrant church without any qualification. But during the period from about 1945 into the 1960s, Catholics moved into the center of American life. The President Kennedy's election was the symbolic sense that Catholics were no longer out on the edge. But now we're back out on the edge again. We're newly immigrant. So we were immigrant, we're post-immigrant, and now we're newly immigrant. That's the makeup of our congregations. 30% of the Catholic Church, at least 30% nationally, are immigrants in the United States. So my point is, immigration is part of our lived experience. At the level of policy and principle, we have been in favor of immigration reform again and again in the U.S. Congress. One of the most significant reforms was Senator Kennedy, Senator Ted Kennedy, with Alan Simpson, a Republican, in the days when you could go across the aisle and produce something. 1986, immigration reform. So we're for immigration reform, we're for a path to citizenship, and we're for protecting people. And so therefore, I think on all of those grounds, we will try and take care of our congregation. We'll try and advocate for immigration reform and for those actions that can prevent families from being broken up. We'll do that. There'll be other issues. We're always talking about socioeconomic issues as well as church-state issues. So there'll be a whole agenda, but immigration will be central for us because it has been for a long time, before this election of this president or anybody else.
Mark, I know you've tried to... I know on behalf of your other job besides writing books, the Save the Children Action Network, you have tried to get in touch with the transition team, the Trump transition team, about your issues. Last I heard, you hadn't had any success. Any updates?
We are, Save the Children Action Network is the advocacy arm, Margery, for Save the Children, which is a international organization that does work here in the U.S. and in 120 countries around the world. And we were created, Save the Children Action Network, about 3 years ago to try to hold political leaders accountable when it came to kids issues, primarily maternal and child health internationally, and domestically here, the issue of early childhood education, expanding the quality and the accessibility on that front. And we are engaged in the political arena as well. I've used the term, which everybody tells me is crazy, but I like it, which is that we want to be the NRA for kids.
Not a bad idea.
And, you know, people, there's a murmur like that every time I say it. But if you think about it, you know, everybody, whether you like the NRA or not, they have grassroots mobilization, they understand the press, and they hold people, elected officials, accountable at the ballot box. And if you think for a second, you know, who's doing that for kids? I mean, there is nobody. So we're trying to fill that void. And we met with all of the presidential candidates during the course of the campaign. We worked a lot in New Hampshire, in Iowa, South Carolina. We had troubles getting through, honestly, to one campaign, which is the Trump campaign. And we have had troubles in the transition. We've reached out to various people that we think can get us in there to start having conversations, and those are starting to happen. It's slow, it's coming together slowly. And, you know, with a new Secretary of Education, that will, and a new potential Secretary of Health and Human Services, those issues will pop up now, and there'll be somebody we can go talk to.
You know, before we open up the floor for questions, you tried mightily, as a good journalist should, to get an interview with the Pope, or sit down with the Pope. You used every possible connection you possibly could, and you came up short. But nonetheless...
You just ruined the end of the book.
I'm sorry. I'm sorry. I'm sorry. I should have said a spoiler alert.
Yeah, that's okay. Don't worry about it.
But, well, I'm going to ruin the end of the book again then. Because you end...
No, go ahead. It's fine.
You end with a great story
yes.
about with your wife and your children
Yes.
going in to see him say Mass
Yes.
and watching him sit and pray and getting really close to him. Tell us about that.
So essentially, you're 100% right, Margery. You know, the idea was, after spending 2 years understanding, reading his homilies, talking to his colleagues, to have an interview with the guy, and I tried everything I could. And ultimately, he turned me down, and I was disappointed at first, but he made absolutely 100% the right decision. That this book is about him, trying to understand him, to teach people and myself about faith and mercy and humility. But he should have turned me down. And that was exactly the right move. And because I could have asked him questions, but I really, as a great teacher, he had already taught me by studying his example. And that's what a great teacher does. And he teaches, you know, me, and I hope everybody in here, every day by his example and by his words. So, you know, once somebody asked me, the other day somebody asked, what would you have asked him? And I had about 50 questions, but most of them I already have them answered. So anyways, we get turned down. I'm disappointed. My mother-in-law dies on March 23rd at 2 in the morning. I'd befriended a couple of Jesuits in Rome. That afternoon at 5, I get an email that says, Pope Francis would like you and your family to come to Mass on June 17th at the Vatican. Are you interested? And I'm like, wow. Yes. So my mother-in-law got to work immediately. She got to heaven, and bam. And she was a very quiet, not like my mother, father. She was very calm and didn't, you know, go after her, things like that. But anyways, we went. And you show up at 6:30 in the morning. You go through a side gate, and you go into the chapel at Santa Marta. It's 15 priests in the front row, you know, 2 rows, and then about 20 people. And we sat in there. Everybody's in black. My wife, Jeannie, our 3 children, all in black. The Pope comes out of the side, little room over there, does the Mass. And it was bizarre to know a guy for 3 years and study him, and have him be as close as the guy in the red outfit there, and know him, and know his friends, and not know him, right?
Yeah.
And then I've noticed in the back of the little chapel, have you been in there, Father, Santa Marta?
Once.
Yeah, once. And there's a guy in kind of a sweater and a woman in a brightly colored dress, totally different clothes. I'm like, that's kind of weird. And so after Mass, the service is over, they tell you to sit down. And then everybody's sitting there, you know, kind of praying, hanging out. And the Pope comes out of a side door and literally walks right by our son, and sits right where that step is. And just hangs there for 10 minutes praying. And my wife had no idea. She's like, where'd the Pope go? I'm like, right over there. Don't look. And he's like, I gotta, you know, and he's praying. And then he got up and walked out of the back of the little chapel. You get your picture taken with him. I, of course, stumbled. I thought I was going to say something brilliant, and I was like, blah, blah, blah. And, you know, then he said, don't forget to pray for me to the kids in English, and the kids said, okay, we got a picture taken. And then it's over. It's over in like a minute, and it's, wow.
Yeah,
so we go out, we get a coffee, and we're eating their croissants, and the couple come in, right? And they say, hi, how are you? And they speak English. They're from Argentina. And the guy says, oh, I'm in Argentina. I said, oh, I was in Argentina. I know these guys down there. I met these priests, Father Pepe. And he goes, oh, I know Pepe. And this is the guy that the Pope put in the villas, the very poor sections. So we start doing the name game, and I know a couple of the priests that he knows. And I said, well, why are you here? And he goes, I'm with my girlfriend. We're traveling around. I met the Pope on the subway about when I was 17. And I'm like, you met the Pope on the subway? And he goes, yeah. And, you know, he talked to me about Catholicism, and had me go down and work in the villas with Pepe, and, you know, that's how I got to know Pepe. And I said, well, when did you see him last? And he goes, like 4 years ago, just before he became Pope. And I said, well, how did you end up here? Well, you must be good pals with him. And he goes, no, I was in the general congregation there on Wednesday when the Pope goes through in the Pope-mobile and waves at everybody. And he gets out of the Pope-mobile, sees this guy. And he goes, I can't remember the guy's name. Let's just say Andrew, hey, how are you? And the guy goes, you remember me? And he goes, of course. I got out of the Pope-mobile to say hi to you. He introduces him to his girlfriend that he's traveling around in Europe with. They're not married. And the Pope goes, hey, do you want to come to Mass tomorrow? And the guy goes, sure.
Why not?
And he goes, give me your phone number. He gives him his cell phone number. He hands it to his, aide. And the guy goes, he gives him a hug, and it's like, wow. And they sat, I said, what happened? He goes, I sat with my cell phone, 2 o'clock, 3 o'clock, 4 o'clock, nobody called. 5 o'clock, the phone rings, and the guy says, you friends with the Pope? I said, yeah, I'm friends with the Pope. He says, show up at the gate at 6:30. And we have no clothes, because we're traveling through Europe. So, my girlfriend's in this red, ugly outfit, and I'm in a sport coat. And I said, wow. And he was the last one in line for the picture. And I said, what did the Pope say to you? And he said, Francesco goes, you crashed the party. And he gave me a hug. And I'm like, that's the story. Okay. I mean, the guy is driving around in the Pope-mobile in the middle of St. Peter's Square and sees this guy he hasn't seen in 4 years, stops it, gives him a hug, and invites his girlfriend and him, who are traveling in sin, to Mass, to have Mass in the morning. Okay. It's a pretty good story, right?
Right. On that sinful, outrageous note, we're going to open up to questions. I think we have a microphone somewhere.
There's a couple of them out there.
A couple of them. If anybody has any questions for Bryan Hehir or Mark Shriver, please feel free to step up.
I'm stepping up.
Okay, great.
My name is Ray Mack. I'm from West Bridgewater. I was in the seminary with Bryan Hehir. And he was a couple of years ahead of me. When I listen to Margery every day.
Oh, good. Thank you.
My question is, it seems from what I'm reading that if you take the majority of the American hierarchy, that they're not too thrilled with some of the things that Pope Francis is advocating. One bit of information would be, and I might be wrong on the percentages, but the American Catholics that voted for Donald Trump was pretty high up, like 45%. And when you read articles about this, they're saying that the parish priests were really advocating for Donald Trump and really encouraging people because of the abortion issue to really get behind Donald Trump. So could you make any comments about that?
Well, there were a couple of stories in the paper about that, but I think they really were outlier stories. I have no statistical evidence, so I can't speak from that. But first of all, if somebody's talking about a candidate from the pulpit, they're in trouble with both church rules and IRS rules. So that's the first thing. That's the first thing to keep in mind. There has not been any instruction to priests to talk about candidates. In my over 50 years in the priesthood, most of it spent on the bridge between public life and the life of the church. So if they did. Now, the question about what the American hierarchy thinks of Francis, again, I just don't have evidence, but I know some of the major figures in the life of the church. Certainly, you can't find much stronger support for Francis than Cardinal O'Malley, but equally the case, Cardinal Wuerl in Washington, Cardinal Supich, just named in Chicago, Bishop McElroy in San Diego. These are people I know personally, have known for years. I worked for them. Strong support. Does all of bishops in the United States, 194 dioceses, support Francis? I have no statistical evidence, but my guess is that there's a lot more that support him than don't.
The great thing about Francis also is that, as Father mentioned a couple minutes ago, he doesn't get into, a party or an ideology. He's talking about God, and he, works brilliantly, talks about the issues and trying to move the country, in this case in Argentina, forward. And one woman told me she was so mad at him because he had reached out to the owner of this nightclub where her son died in a fire, and he had been there for all the kids that got killed in this fire on New Year's Eve, and she thought he was on their side. against the owner of the nightclub and the band that put the event together. And he reached out to the people in jail and wrote them notes and told them he was praying for them. And she didn't talk to him for a year and a half and criticized him in the press. And I said, what happened? And she said, well, eventually I realized that he's correct, that he always tries to get us to rise above our differences and to see what is really important, and that is to come together, that the sinners and those that are hurt also deserve mercy. And I think we could all benefit from political leaders and church leaders who find the commonality in what we're all striving to do as pilgrims. I mean, to use the name of the book, we're all pilgrims on this journey together, right? And instead of trying to divide us, the things that pull us together, which is our shared humanity, which is what he did with this grieving mother and this guy who was sitting in jail for having created a night that killed 200 people, is he tried to show mercy to both of them. It'd be so nice if we had political leaders who showed some mercy and showed some humility and tried to rise above the partisanship of it all and did that.
Yes?
Frank Parker, Jesuit, Boston College. Thank you for all the nice comments about Jesuits.
Well, the only problem with you, Father, is I went to Holy Cross, so you're in the wrong school. So if you come to Holy Cross in Worcester, you're doing all right. But, although my daughter goes to Boston College. Is this being recorded?
Too late. Too late.
I love BC.
Well, I taught at BC for 40 years, and I graduated from Holy Cross.
There you go.
Well, why didn't you go to work there then? What happened to you?
They didn't let me.
Oh.
I also had the pleasure of knowing your father and seeing your father's wonderful work in Africa, which we all appreciate.
Thank
my
you.
My question was from Miss Eagan, though, on secular newspapers today. For years, you and Beverly Beckham and John Allen have written very clearly about Catholicism to the wider public. But I was terribly upset when John Allen's relationship with the Globe ended. And it doesn't seem now that there is much writing about Catholicism by people who write it and say, I am a Catholic, the way you three have done. I wonder if you see any hope for that, particularly as newspapers are doing so poorly now.
Well, let me say, I was very disappointed when John Allen's relationship with the Globe ended, because that was the crux website, right, a second job, and it was really helpful to have that second job with 3 kids just out of college. But you know something? It was basically newspapers are in big trouble. The Globe, every newspaper's in big trouble, and Crux wasn't making enough money. That was the bottom line. I thought that the Globe could have promoted it maybe a little bit more, but it's a hard sell. And you know what was really interesting is that I used to work at that naughty little tabloid, the Boston Herald, for years as a columnist there, and then I went to the Globe to work for Crux, because even though I was writing these stories, I called you in a couple of these stories. You remember,
did.
you know, criticizing the church about this and that and the other thing. I was always, not always, but for a good part of my life, a Catholic. And what was interesting is that people that had read me for years at the Herald, I went to this Globe Crux website, this Catholic website, and it just stopped. I was like I had disappeared. So I don't know if it's that people aren't that interested in Catholicism, or, by the way, Crux still exists with John Allen. It's just not run by the Globe anymore. So he still has his website. But it was disappointing for a lot of us. Crux only lasted not even 2 years. I think we thought it would last 3, 4, or 5 years, but all I can say is that it was basically, as I understand it, a bottom line decision. It wasn't making any money, and that was the end of that. And you don't see much writing about religion, you're right, in newspapers, but because newspapers have had to cut back on so much of, there's a lot of great websites dealing with religion, you know, that are just online. But you're right, I think it's just like arts criticism and like some other things that have gone by the board for money reasons. Religious writing has gone by the boards too.
In discussion with French diplomats with their election coming next year. It's really quite remarkable.
Yeah, he's a great reporter, John Allen. He knows everything there is to know, and it was really disappointing. But yes.
Hello, I'm Peg Morrison from Newton, from Sacred Heart Church. I went to Regis College because women were not allowed to go to BC or Holy Cross. But our two sons went to BC and Holy Cross.
Good.
Anyway, my question is from a talk that I went to last month with Father Hehir over at BC High, and you talked about the Francis Project. And you said there were three main things: inequality, immigration, and the environment. Do you think that Pope Francis will continue his advocacy for those issues? And do you think the Catholic Church here in the United States, I know you talked a bit about immigration, will also talk about inequality and the environment?
I don't think there's any doubt the Pope will continue with those three issues. I use those as exemplary issues, but they have been major issues for him: inequality within nations and between nations. And then secondly, the document on the environment, which is not a topic I know a lot about, to be very honest. I don't have the scientific background to really master that. But I'll tell you, that piece of work was a masterpiece. The way he put together empirical data, moral argument, and religious argument. It was just a masterpiece of work. So that document has lasting impact. The one version of it is that was published by an English publishing house. A colleague on the Harvard faculty, whom I really don't know, she's a professor of history, of the history of science, and she wrote a compelling introduction to that letter about the power of that letter. So I don't have any doubt he'll deal with all three of those. He'll deal with several others in addition, and I think he will catalyze the rest of the church to engage these issues.
There's a great series of talks the Pope has given to a group called the World Popular Movements. And, I mentioned this guy, Sergio Sanchez, who is a friend of the Pope's, who picks up plastic and cardboard, is a member of a group called the Cartoneros. And if you want, it's in the book, but he has had a subsequent meeting with him. If you really, I think, want to, and John Allen has written this, and Austin Iverly, if you really want to see the heart of Francis, and he talks about inequality, he talks about land, he talks about the environment, he talks about jobs with these folks. And when this Sergio Sanchez told me this story when I was in his recycling plant in Buenos Aires, and Sergio's about 5'7" with a tattoo of Mary on his forearm, and a statue of Mary inside the recycling plant. It's made out of cardboard, and she's in a trash collector's outfit. It's a beautiful, beautiful thing, and it's up on the wall, and they have flowers underneath of it. And he brings these folks to Rome, and he met with them in Brazil as well. And when he told me this, I thought he was, crazy. I couldn't believe that Sergio Sanchez had hung out for 3 days in the Vatican with the Pope, with Cardinal Turkson. And he took Turkson around, who's in charge of peace and justice for the Pope, in a used ambulance through Buenos Aires. And the Pope asked him to go down there and learn from this guy, Sergio Sanchez. And he has waste pickers from, Rwanda, people working on housing issues in Canada. And when he told me this, I thought he meant, well, maybe the head of the AFL-CIO is there, the head of Save the Children, the head of all these big, state Department of HHS, those types of people. And they're not. All 150 people invited, you've never heard of. And those meetings are not covered in the Times, the Globe, ABC, NBC, the Wall Street Journal. You got to dig around. Read those speeches, and then you'll see the heart of Francis, and it is just so powerful. And he's talking about those issues, and he's hammering away on them, and he's telling people, including the cardinals, to listen to those people, because you want to be with the poor and for the poor. You want to just not provide the services. You want to provide support to them, but you want to learn from them, and that they are the ones to create real change, lasting change, not change forced from on high by political leadership. It's really powerful. World Popular Movements. I'm sorry.
My name is Maureen Murray, and I had a question for Mark Shriver. I wondered during your time learning about Pope Francis if you gained any insight on his appreciation for women religious. Before he came in, there was a time that the Vatican had seriously chastised women religious in the United States,
Yes.
feeling that they were focusing on audiences they shouldn't and that type of thing.
Yes.
And his visit here to me seemed that he felt very differently about them. I recently read a book about Robert Kennedy, and I thought it was funny. He would say to his children, look at it this way, the priests are the Republicans and the nuns are the Democrats. I thought, no offense to Father Hehir, but I thought that was an interesting perspective. And I just wondered if you gained any insight to how Pope Francis views women religious around the world.
I think I'll let Father Hehir answer part of that question. I mean, not the.
I thought the Jesuits were the Republicans.
Not the ones I know. But anyways, I think, yeah, I mean, I talked to a number of nuns and women theologians in Argentina that had very positive things to say about him and the work he did there and the fact that he stood beside them and up behind them on a number of occasions. The ones I talked to were not pushing the idea of women priests. They were pushing the idea of more of a voice for women in the Catholic Church. This is not America, this is Argentina, that's what they were saying. I think the part I was going to leave to you is, and we haven't discussed it, is he set up this group to look at the issue of women becoming deacons. And if that actually happens, and what little tea leaves I understand to read, it seems like that might happen, that allows women to participate much more actively in the church's life, to preach, and to perform a lot of the services that priests now do. And if that happens, is it women priests? No. Is this planting a seed that will blossom in some way in 100 years from now? I guess so. And that's what makes them exciting. So that's part of the answer. I don't know if you want to talk about that.
I think also, I said earlier, words and deeds go with him. What he says and how he makes choices, it's not ironclad, but their relationship. It is very interesting that the man that was just one, there were 3 cardinals from the United States in the last consistory a couple of weeks ago. One of them works in Rome. The other was Archbishop Supich in Chicago. And the third was Archbishop Tobin, who was in Indianapolis. Tobin worked in the Vatican in the Congregation of Religious, which governed religious men and women. And he was known to be a very positive voice when there was a critique of the American religious women. He was known for his work. He was careful. It was done in a balanced way. But there was no doubt that the sisters in the United States saw him as a major support. And now he's been made Archbishop of Newark and a cardinal. So I think that says something.
Thank you. I think the Pope also said that women were strawberries on top of the cake or something like that. What did he say? Or we were the icing on the cake. But, I thought, well, he's older, maybe. But anyway, everyone can grow in that regard. I try to take it not too seriously. Good, we've got time for 2 more questions. We've got 2 more questioners. So, yes, sir.
Sure. I'm a priest as well. I'm a pastor in Lexington. And just a couple of comments that I invite your comments on. Bryan and I know each other very, very well. The first one is that in his letter, The Joy of Love, Amoratio Laetitia, chapter 8 is the place where he makes reference to the way in which Catholics are invited to speak to a priest if they're divorced and remarried and have not had annulments and so on. And the question earlier was about the changes that he's made. And that's a very, very significant change. It's a huge thing. And I think that it has sent a message to a lot of people who are divorced and remarried and who oftentimes can feel very, very alienated from the church. And so I think that's a very significant thing. And I've already had some experience with people who have heard that and who've come, so as a result of that, to sort of reflect upon where they are in their own spiritual journey. The second thing that I think is quite significant is that in the annulment process itself, he's created a third way in terms of annulments. There are two ways right now, a documentary annulment or a canonical trial. And the third way is called the briefer process. And it's a little technical, kind of inside baseball, but it's a significant change and a significant addition in the way in which people who are divorced and remarried can seek an annulment and have their marriage blessed. The third thing that I think, I'm not sure many people agree with me about this, but a lot of folks think that Pope John Paul II closed the door completely and tightly on the ordination of women. And when Pope Francis was recently asked about that, and the question was, well, did Pope John Paul II sort of close the door in that whole piece? He said, well, it would seem that it's moving in that direction. And so I think that is a different kind of an answer. It isn't saying yes definitively, but I think, to your point, Bryan, about kind of being on the edge without stepping over the line, I think it represents a significant change. So I do think that he's had a tremendous change. Not only has he changed the tone of things, but I think that in some very significant ways, he's added some significant changes to the way in which we function in the life of the church.
Mm-hmm. I think that's fair. I mean, I've never been known to be a good canonist, so I'm not too sure I got all of those points that you rightfully highlighted. I think one of the best essays that was ever written in my reading of Francis, when he was Man of the Year in Time magazine,
yes.
And the editor of Time magazine is a woman. I'm blanking on her name at the minute, and her essay on Francis at that time, it was early on, she said, he hasn't changed the words, but he's changed the music. And that was a good way of describing this. But it is this thing, he's very careful because he's trying to build consensus, even as he tries to open the church as much as possible to people's lives.
We're almost out of time, so we should make this question fairly quickly. Thank you.
My name is Bob Hart. I'm a graduate of Boston College, and I'm a docent here at the Kennedy Library. And I just want to, first of all, congratulate Mark on this great book, and also on the book about his father. Your father was one of my heroes.
Thank you.
I'll just tell you a couple of brief stories, very brief, no more than a minute, about your father and your mother. On the morning of President Kennedy's inauguration, he took a piece of paper out of his pocket, and he wrote on it, Peace Corps, when do we begin? And he sent it through the crowd to your father, because his father had been appointed by the president to be the first head of the Peace Corps. And the piece of paper came back, and it said on it, tomorrow morning. And that's what they did. They started working on it immediately, and they got the legislation through Congress, and the rest is history. Now, the story about your mother. Your mother, as you know, was a great champion for the mentally retarded. You had an aunt who was retarded. And when President Kennedy was elected, there was very little in the way of public funds for services to the retarded. And your mother started a campaign with the president saying, you've got to get something through Congress to set up funds to go to the states for improved services to the retarded. And she kept after him and after him and after him, and the legislation got through Congress and was signed 1 month before the president died.
Well, thank you for both those stories. I was in the Maryland legislature for 8 years, and my mother got after me and got after me and got after me. When we had bills on housing, she's like, where are people with developmental differences going to be in that? And I'm like, well, I just had a baby last week. And she's like, where are the people? So I feel that story. Yeah.
And Father Hehir was one of my professors in graduate school, and he's a tremendous teacher.
He is indeed.
What time do you have? I have 8:25. Do you have 8:25? I think it's 8:25.
Yeah, that's right, 8:25.
8:25. Really quick, sir, because we want to get everybody out of here in time.
My name is Rob Senator. I live on Cape Cod.
speaking as you were of secular newspapers, there is a major metropolitan daily south and west of where we are right now. And Pilgrimage was reviewed there last Sunday. And I thought I might ask Mark to comment upon what appeared to a layman to be a criticism, i.e. not covering in Pilgrimage Pope Francis's time during the Troubles in Buenos Aires.
Sure, I can talk about that very quickly. There was, speaking of crux, Father, there was a big review today by Austin Iverly of Pilgrimage, which was very positive. So I thought you were going to plug a Holy Cross grad, but you left me hanging there, Father. I think the answer to that is, I don't know the one you saw, maybe it was one that was in the New York Times about it, but the issue for me is when I was in Argentina, I talked to dozens, hundreds of people, and all of whom told me that the Dirty War, which was in the late 70s into 83, was an incredibly complex and chaotic time. That the Army didn't know what the Navy was doing, the Navy didn't know what the Army was doing, the police force was doing something different. People they thought were rebels were in tight with the Army, and people they thought were in tight with the Navy were taken and disappeared, never to be seen again. And what I know is that the people that I talked to, that a couple of whom don't like Pope Francis today personally, who were Jesuits, told me that he took steps that saved their lives, that they were mad when he did it in the 70s. They didn't understand it. They got angry with him, and he saved their lives. Other guys who speak very highly of him say the same thing to me. And to a person, they say, and you'll see it in the book, that there was chaos and confusion. And it's a very complex time, and people literally would put their heads down and go quiet and shake their head. I know that no Jesuit died during that war. I know that other priests and other nuns did die. And I left the answer to my to where I come out on that is, upset maybe one or two biographers, but I'm not a biographer. I'm a pilgrim trying to figure out how to bring joy into my life. And I'm not condemning people here. I'm trying to figure out that riddle, if you will. And the answer for me was, no Jesuits died. And as he said, could he have done more? Where there were people who thought they were doing great things for Argentina, who were sinners, and others who were doing bad things to Argentina, who were doing the best they could. So I said, you know what? Who am I to judge?
Yeah.
And I'll leave that up to God and Bergoglio.
I can just reinforce what chaos was like in 1977, I think.
Yeah.
I was on staff for the American bishops, and we had to go to Argentina for a meeting of the Latin American bishops and the U.S. bishops. And we went to a place called Mar del Plata, which is a kind of remote area, and they had to surround the meeting with guns. The bishops had to be protected with guns. When we went into the town, and the bishop of the area was named Peronio, and all over the walls were written Peronio Comunista, and Peronio gathered the U.S. bishops one night of that meeting. He said, I just want you to know what happened. He said, it was Holy Week. We were there the week after Holy Week. He said, on Holy Thursday, I had a friend who was in the Argentinian military or police. He called me and he said, they're coming to get you tonight. And he said, it was Holy Thursday night. And he said, the nuns and I prayed in the chapel all night long, waiting for them to come to get us. They didn't. But eventually the Vatican had to take Peronio out of Argentina because his life was at risk. So the general chaotic situation it was very, very, very difficult for anybody who was there making choices in the middle of that.
Thank you.
Well, I want to thank you all for coming tonight. I want to thank you, Stephen Rothstein, for inviting us to Kennedy Library, Mark Shriver, Pilgrimage. Thank you very much, Father Bryan here. Thank you very much. Thank you all for coming.
Great job.